Welcome back to Calm Art Studio. In the first part of this series, we rested in Vincent van Gogh's early years, his childhood in the quiet Dutch village, his sensitive nature, his deep faith, and his early attempts to find purpose through work and belief. Tonight, we continue forward into a time of searching and movement following Vincent as he leaves home, enters the working world, and struggles to find belonging through love, labor, and spiritual devotion. These are years shaped by uncertainty, longing, and quiet disappointment, long before painting became central to his life. If slow, reflective storytelling like this helps you unwind, you're warmly invited to subscribe and continue these gentle explorations with us. And if you feel like it, you're welcome to share where in the world you're listening from tonight in the comments. It's grounding to imagine these thoughts moving softly across distance, settling into many quiet places. And now to continue the story. Vincent had reached his late 20s, and still he did not know what he was meant to do with his life. He had tried to be an art dealer. That had ended badly. He had tried to be a teacher, standing before rows of students in England, but that had not lasted either. He had worked in a bookshop. He had tried to bring comfort to coal miners in Belgium, living among them in the cold and the dark, reading from the Bible, sitting with the sick. But even that had come to nothing. The church authorities had not approved of his methods. They had sent him away. Now he was back in his parents' home, and he had nothing. No profession. No clear path forward. He was no longer young. His younger brother Theo had already established himself in Paris, working for an art gallery, earning his own living. Vincent had tried so many things, and each time something had gone wrong. Each time he had failed to fit into the world that others seemed to navigate so easily. He felt the weight of it. The years that had passed. The expectations that had faded. His parents were kind, but he could sense their worry. What would become of him? What could he do? There was a kind of despair in those days. Not the loud, dramatic kind, but the quiet sort that settles in when you realize you have been walking in circles. He had wanted so badly to be useful. To help people. To mean something. And yet every door had closed. He spent time alone. He walked through the countryside around his parents' village. He thought about the miners he had known in Belgium, their faces marked by exhaustion and coal dust. He thought about the families he had visited, the small rooms lit by single candles, the children who had so little. He had wanted to bring them comfort through faith, through words. But he had not been allowed to continue. And then, quietly, almost without deciding, he began to draw. It was not a sudden revelation. It was not as though he woke one morning and knew what he must do. It was more like reaching for something familiar in the dark. He had always been around art. He had worked for years at Goupil and Say, handling paintings and prints, looking at them every day. He knew the names of artists. He knew what sold and what did not. But he had never thought of himself as someone who could make art. That had never seemed like a possibility. Still, he picked up a pencil. He found some paper. He began to draw the things he saw around him. A farmer. A woman working in a field. A pair of hands holding a tool. Simple things. Ordinary things. The drawings were not skillful. He had no training. He did not know how to measure proportions correctly or how to make shadows fall in a convincing way. But something about the act of drawing felt right to him. It felt like a language he could begin to learn, It felt like something he could do with his hands and his attention that might, in some small way, matter. He began to think about the people he had known. The miners in the Borinage. The laboring families he had met. He thought about their dignity even in hardship. He thought about how rarely anyone paid attention to them, really looked at them. And he began to believe that drawing them, capturing their faces and their work, might be a way to honor them. A way to say that their lives had weight and meaning. He did not think he would become famous. He did not imagine galleries or museums. He only thought that perhaps, if he could learn to draw well enough, he could make images that told the truth about people's lives. Images that showed compassion. That was what he wanted. Not success, but usefulness. A way to be of service, even if it was quiet and unseen. He kept drawing. He filled pages with figures, with landscapes, with studies of trees and rooftops and hands. He made mistakes. He grew frustrated. But he did not stop. His family was uncertain about this new direction. What kind of living could a person make from drawing? Especially someone who had already failed at so many other things. But Theo, his younger brother, was different. Theo wrote letters from Paris. He sent encouragement. He believed that Vincent should keep trying, that this might be the path he had been searching for. Vincent was not confident. He was not sure he had any special ability. But he felt something stirring in him that he had not felt before. A sense that perhaps, after all the false starts and closed doors, he had finally found something he could commit to. Something that might allow him to express what he felt, but could not say in words. It was not a dramatic decision. It was not a moment of clarity where everything suddenly made sense. It was quieter than that. It was simply the slow realization that this was what he wanted to spend his time doing. Drawing. Looking closely at the world. Trying to put what he saw onto paper. He did not know if he would be good at it. He did not know if anyone would ever care about the images he made. But he felt, for the first time in a long while, that he had found a direction. A purpose. Something to move toward. And so he began. Late, uncertain, with no guarantees. He began to teach himself to be an artist. Not because he believed it would bring him success or recognition, but because it felt like the only honest thing left to do. Because it allowed him to look at the people and places he cared about and to try, in his own clumsy, earnest way, to say that they mattered. He worked alone. He studied the few art books he could find. He made copies of prints. He drew from life whenever he could. He did not have a teacher at first. He did not have a studio. He only had his pencils and his paper and the growing sense that this was what he needed to do. The days passed quietly. The drawings accumulated. And Vincent, who had spent so many years searching for a way to be useful, finally felt that he had found one. Vincent began his studies later than most who become artists. By the time he decided to learn to draw seriously, other painters his age had already spent years in academies, learning for masters, building their skills in proper studios. Vincent was starting from the beginning. He had no formal training. He had never sat in a classroom and learned the rules of perspective or the structure of the human body. He was teaching himself, slowly, with whatever materials he could gather. He understood that drawing was the foundation. Before he could paint, before he could work with color and light, he needed to learn how to see. how to translate what his eyes observed onto a flat surface, how to make a line suggest depth or weight or movement. These were not things that came naturally. They had to be learned through repetition, through trial and error, through hours of patient work. So he practiced. Every day he practiced. He found instructional books. One of them was a drawing course by Charles Bargue, a series of lithographs designed to teach students how to draw the human figure. The course started with simple forms and gradually increased in difficulty. Vincent worked through these exercises methodically. He would copy a plate from the book, trying to match the proportions, the shading, the weight of each line. Then he would set his copy aside and try again. And again. The work was repetitive. It was not exciting. It did not feel like art in the way he imagined art might feel. It felt like carpentry or mathematics. It felt like learning scales on a piano. But he knew it was necessary. He believed that if he could train his hand to follow his eye, if he could learn to measure and observe accurately, then eventually he would be able to draw the things that mattered to him. The faces of working people. The shape of a bent back. The way light fell across a simple room. He also studied anatomy. He found medical textbooks and diagrams that showed the structure of bones and muscles. He copied these too, trying to understand how a shoulder connected to an arm, how the skull shaped the face, how the body held its weight when standing or sitting. He drew skeletons. He drew hands in different positions. He drew feet, which were difficult, with their small bones and angles. It was slow work. His early drawings were clumsy. The proportions were often wrong. A head might be too large for the body. An arm might bend at an unnatural angle. The shading would be uneven, too dark in some places, too light in others. He could see the mistakes. He knew when something did not look right. But knowing and fixing were two different things. He did not give up. He believed that progress came through accumulation. That if he drew 100 hands, the 101st would be better. That if he copied a figure 10 times, the 11th attempt would show improvement. He was willing to accept slow progress. He was willing to do the boring, unglamorous work of learning. He also worked with perspective manuals. These books taught how to create the illusion of three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. How to draw a room so that it looked like you could walk into it. How to make a road recede into the distance. How to place objects in relation to each other so that they seemed to occupy real space. Perspective involved rules. Lines that converged at a vanishing point. Measurements that had to be calculated. It was technical, almost architectural. Vincent was not naturally inclined toward this kind of precise, mathematical thinking. But he worked at it anyway. He drew grids. He drew boxes and cubes, rotating them in space. He drew simple interiors, trying to make the walls and floor meet at the correct angles. Sometimes the work felt futile. He would spend an entire afternoon on a single drawing, only to realize at the end that something fundamental was wrong. The figure was stiff. The perspective was off. The whole thing felt lifeless. He would feel a wave of discouragement. The gap between what he wanted to create and what he was capable of creating seemed impossibly wide. But he kept going. He had spent too many years searching for something that felt right to abandon it now. Drawing was difficult, but it was also the only thing that made him feel like he was moving toward something rather than drifting aimlessly. So he picked up his pencil again. He started another drawing. He tried again. He worked alone most of the time. He did not have classmates to compare himself to, or a teacher to correct his mistakes. He had only the books, and his own stubborn determination, and the slow accumulation of small improvements that were almost too subtle to notice day by day, but became visible over weeks and months. He drew laborers, men digging, women carrying bundles. These were the subjects that interested him most. He wanted to capture the weight of their work, the dignity of their effort. But to do that convincingly, he first had to understand how bodies moved, how clothes draped over a bent shoulder, how light and shadow defined form. So he kept practicing the basics. He filled sketchbooks, page after page of studies. Heads from different angles, hands in different positions, feet, ears, eyes. He was building a vocabulary slowly, one word at a time, learning the grammar of seeing and representing. There were moments when he felt he was making progress. A drawing would come together in a way that surprised him. A line would feel confident. A shadow would fall correctly. These moments were brief, but they kept him going. They were proof that the work was not entirely pointless. That something was being learned, even if it was difficult to measure. But mostly, the work was just work. It was showing up each day and sitting down with his materials and trying to get a little bit better. It was accepting that most of what he made would not be good. That failure was part of the process. That the only way forward was through repetition. He copied from life whenever he could. He would go out into the village or the countryside and find someone willing to sit for him. Often it was a farmer or a laborer, someone who had a weathered face and strong hands. He would set up his sketchbook and try to capture what he saw. The person's posture, the texture of their clothing, the way their face settled into an expression. This was harder than copying from books. People moved. The light changed. His subjects grew tired or restless. And there was the added pressure of trying to capture something true about the person in front of him, not just their physical appearance, but some sense of their character, their life. He did not always succeed. Often he did not. But he kept trying. He also drew landscapes, trees, fields, buildings. These were quieter subjects. They did not move or grow impatient. He could study them at his own pace, observing how branches divided, how a roof met the sky, how distance softened details. Landscapes taught him about space and light, about how to suggest depth without overwhelming a drawing with information. The practice was meditative in its way. The repetition, the focus required. When he was drawing, he was not thinking about his failures or his uncertain future. He was only thinking about the line in front of him, the shadow he was trying to render, the shape he was trying to understand. It was absorbing work. It quieted his mind. But it was also exhausting. Drawing for hours required concentration and physical effort. His hand would cramp. His eyes would tire. Sometimes he would have to stop, not because he wanted to, but because his body demanded rest. He read about art. He studied reproductions of paintings by artists he admired. He looked at their compositions, their use of light and shadow, their treatment of the human figure. He tried to understand what made their work effective, what choices they had made, how they had solved the problems he was now facing. He did not try to imitate their styles. He was not trying to become them. But he wanted to learn from them, to understand the principles they had used, to see if those principles could help him in his own work. The months passed. The drawings accumulated. Some were better than others. Some showed clear improvement. Others felt like steps backward. But together they represented hours and hours of patient effort, of showing up, of refusing to quit even when the work felt difficult and unrewarding. Vincent did not know if he would ever be good enough. He did not know if he had talent or if he was simply stubborn. But he knew that he was learning. Slowly. Imperfectly. But learning nonetheless. His hand was becoming more confident. His eye was becoming more accurate. The gap between what he saw and what he could draw was narrowing, even if it was narrowing so slowly that he could barely perceive it. He accepted this. He accepted that becoming an artist was not a sudden transformation, but a long, quiet process of accumulation. That there were no shortcuts. That the only way forward was through this daily practice. Through filling pages. Through making mistakes and trying again. And so he continued. Day after day. Drawing. Studying. Practicing. Learning to see. Learning to translate what he saw into marks on paper. Building, slowly and patiently, the foundation he would need for everything that would come after. Vincent had no money. That was the simple truth of his situation. He was learning to draw, working every day, filling pages with studies and sketches, but he was not earning a living. He could not support himself. There was no income from his art. No one was buying his drawings. No gallery was interested in representing him. He was a man in his late 20s, living on the goodwill of others, and the weight of that dependency was something he felt every day. His brother Theo sent money. Every month, an envelope would arrive with enough to cover rent, food, and basic supplies. Paper. Pencils. A little bit of ink. The amounts were modest, but they were enough to keep Vincent going. Without Theo's help, he could not have continued. He would have had to find work, some kind of paid employment, and that would have meant giving up the hours he needed to practice and study. Theo's support made it possible for Vincent to dedicate himself fully to learning his craft. Vincent was deeply grateful. He knew what his brother was doing for him. He knew that Theo was working long hours at the art gallery in Paris, earning his own living, and then sending a portion of that income to support someone who had no clear prospects, no guarantee of success. It was an act of faith. Theo believed that Vincent's efforts mattered, that the work he was doing had value, even if no one else could see it yet. But gratitude did not erase the other feelings. Vincent also felt guilt. He felt ashamed that he needed help at all. He was older than Theo. He should have been the one offering support, not receiving it. He should have been established by now, contributing to the family, making something of himself. Instead, he was dependent, unable to take care of his own basic needs. The shame was quiet but persistent. It lived alongside his daily routine. When he bought bread or paid his rent, he was aware that the money was not his. When he purchased a new set of pencils or a pad of paper, he felt the weight of what that small expense represented. It was not just money. It was Theo's belief in him, and the fear that he might be wasting it. He wrote to Theo often. The letters became a lifeline. They were practical, discussing what supplies he needed, what he was working on, what books he was studying. But they were also emotional. Vincent poured his thoughts onto the page. He described his struggles with perspective, his frustrations with proportion, his slow progress. He shared his doubts. He worried aloud that he might never be good enough, that all of Theo's support might come to nothing. But he also tried to reassure his brother. He described the work he was doing in detail, as if to prove that the money was not being wasted. He was working hard. He was disciplined. He was making steady, if slow, progress. He wanted Theo to know that the investment was not frivolous, that Vincent was treating this seriously, that he was not taking the support for granted. Theo wrote back with encouragement. He told Vincent to keep going. He expressed confidence in his brother's abilities. He reminded him that learning took time, that progress was not always visible immediately. Theo's letters were gentle and supportive. They did not demand results or set deadlines. They simply offered belief. This correspondence became essential to Vincent. It was not just about the money, though the money was necessary. It was also about having someone who understood what he was trying to do. Someone who did not dismiss his efforts as foolish or impractical. Someone who thought that becoming an artist, even at this late stage, was a worthwhile pursuit. Vincent lived simply. He rented cheap rooms. He ate plain food. He did not spend money on anything unnecessary. Every franc that Theo sent went toward the essentials. Rent, bread, potatoes, sometimes a little meat. And then whatever was left over went to art supplies. He needed paper constantly. He went through pencils and charcoal quickly. Occasionally he would buy a drawing manual or a book of reproductions to study. There were times when the money ran out before the next envelope arrived. Times when he went hungry for a day or two. Times when he had to choose between buying food and buying the materials he needed to keep working. Usually, he chose the materials. He could skip a meal. He could go without. But if he could not draw, then what was the point of any of it? The poverty was not romantic. It was not the charming struggle of a bohemian artist living carelessly in a garret. It was uncomfortable and exhausting. It meant cold rooms in winter. It meant worn-out shoes. It meant feeling the gap between himself and people who had stable lives, regular income, a sense of security. But Vincent endured it. He had spent years searching for a direction, and now that he had found one, he was not willing to let it go just because it was difficult. He believed that the work mattered. He believed that if he could learn to draw well enough, if he could develop his skills, then eventually he might be able to create something of value. Something that spoke truthfully about the lives of ordinary people. Something that honored their dignity. So he kept going. He woke each morning in his small room and sat down with his materials. He worked for hours. He studied his manuals. He made his copies. He went out to draw from life. And when the day's work was done, he often wrote to Theo, describing what he had accomplished, sharing his thoughts, expressing his gratitude. The guilt never fully went away. Every time he opened an envelope from Theo, he felt it. The knowledge that he was taking from his brother. That Theo's generosity was making his own life possible. He tried to repay this, in his own way, by working harder, by not wasting a single day, by treating the opportunity he had been given with the seriousness it deserved. He also tried to think of the arrangement differently. Theo was an art dealer. He understood paintings and drawings. He knew the market. And he believed that Vincent's work eventually might have value. Perhaps this was not just charity. Perhaps it was an investment. Perhaps Theo saw something in Vincent's dedication, in his vision, that suggested future worth. Vincent clung to this idea sometimes. It made the dependency feel less humiliating. If Theo was investing in his work, then Vincent owed him not just gratitude, but results. Good work. Honest work. Work that justified the faith that had been placed in him. But the reality was simpler and harder than that. Theo was helping because he loved his brother. Because he wanted Vincent to have a chance at finding meaning and purpose. Because he saw how much this mattered to Vincent, and he was willing to make sacrifices to support it. The relationship between them was not a business arrangement. It was something deeper and more generous than that. Vincent knew this. He knew that Theo's support came from care, not calculation. And that knowledge was both comforting and difficult. It meant he was loved. But it also meant he was vulnerable, dependent on someone else's kindness in a way that reminded him constantly of his own inability to stand alone. Still, he continued. He accepted the help because without it, he could not continue. He swallowed his pride and his shame because the alternative was giving up, and he was not ready to do that. He had given up on too many things already. He had walked away from too many attempts at finding his place in the world. This time, he would see it through. Even if it meant living poorly. Even if it meant depending on his brother. Even if it meant carrying the weight of guilt and gratitude together. The work itself became a kind of repayment. Every drawing he completed, every small improvement he made, felt like a way of honoring Theo's belief in him. He could not pay his brother back in money. But perhaps he could pay him back in effort. In dedication. In the slow, patient building of something that might, one day, be worthwhile. Theo never asked for this. He never made Vincent feel that the support was conditional or that he needed to prove himself. But Vincent felt it anyway. He felt the responsibility. The need to justify what was being given to him. And so the months passed in this way. Vincent working steadily in his small rooms. Theo sending money from Paris. Letters traveling back and forth between them, carrying practical details and deeper feelings. A quiet arrangement that made it possible for Vincent to keep learning, keep practicing, keep moving slowly toward the artist he hoped to become. The poverty was real. The dependence was real. The shame was real. But so was the gratitude. So was the love between the two brothers. So was Vincent's determination to make something of this chance he had been given, no matter how long it took, no matter how difficult it was. He did not know if he would succeed. He did not know if his work would ever be seen or valued by anyone beyond Theo. But he knew that he was working honestly. That he was doing everything he could with the resources he had. That he was not squandering the opportunity. And for now, that was enough. It had to be enough. Because it was all he had. The small room. The simple materials. The money from Theo. And the work itself, the daily practice, the slow accumulation of skill and understanding that was happening beneath the surface, invisible but real. He continued. Vincent began to paint. After months of drawing, after filling sketchbooks with studies and copies, he felt ready to try working with color. He bought paints, oils, a few brushes, some small canvases. The materials were expensive, and he had to be careful with them, but he believed he had learned enough about form and proportion to begin exploring what paint could do. His early paintings were dark. He used browns and grays and deep greens, blacks and ochres, the colors of earth and shadow. He was not trying to capture bright sunlight or vivid hues. He was painting the world as he saw it in the countryside around him. The dim interiors of peasant cottages, the fields at dusk, the heavy clothing of laborers. These were not cheerful subjects, and he did not try to make them cheerful. He wanted to paint them as they were. He focused on working people, farmers, weavers, men and women who spent their days in physical labor. He watched them closely. He studied how they moved, how they held their tools, how their bodies bent under the weight of their work. He wanted to capture something essential about their lives. Not to romanticize them, but to show them truthfully, with respect. Vincent believed these people deserved to be seen, not as quaint figures in a picturesque landscape, but as individuals whose labor had dignity and meaning. He had spent time among coal miners in Belgium. He had lived poorly himself. He understood something of what it meant to work hard for little reward, to be overlooked by those who had more comfort and security. He wanted his paintings to acknowledge that, to say that these lives mattered. His style at this time was rooted in realism. He was not interested in the bright, broken colors of the Impressionists, though he knew their work from his time at the art gallery. He was drawn instead to painters who depicted peasant life seriously, artists who used somber tones and solid forms, artists who painted what was real rather than what was beautiful. He studied how light worked in the places he painted. In a simple cottage, the light might come from a single window or a fire. It would fall unevenly, leaving some areas in deep shadow while illuminating others only partially. He tried to capture this. The way a face might be half lit. The way a table or a chair might emerge from darkness. It was difficult work. Oil paint did not behave the way pencil or charcoal did. It had its own properties. It could be layered and blended, but it also dried slowly and required planning. He painted interiors. Small, cramped rooms where families lived and worked. Weavers at their looms. People sitting at a table. A woman sewing by lamplight. These scenes were quiet and still. There was no drama in them. Just the patient recording of ordinary moments. The kind of moments that filled most people's lives, but were rarely considered worth painting. He also painted rural settings. Fields. Cottages. Figures working in the distance. He was drawn to the cycles of agricultural life. Planting and harvesting. The relationship between people and the land they worked. He saw something meaningful in this. Something that connected human effort to the larger rhythms of nature and season. His paintings were not well received. When he showed them to others, the response was often lukewarm or critical. People found them too dark, too heavy, too focused on unpleasant subjects. They did not find them attractive or easy to look at. Some thought they were clumsy, that the figures were stiff or awkwardly proportioned. Others simply did not understand what he was trying to do. This hurt. Vincent wanted his work to be appreciated. He wanted people to see what he saw in these subjects. But the criticism also confirmed something he already suspected: that his vision was not in line with popular taste. That what he cared about was not what most people wanted to see on their walls. He tried to explain his intentions in letters to Theo. He wrote about wanting to show the truth of peasant life, about believing that a painting of working people could be as important as a painting of wealthy patrons or mythological scenes, about trying to use color and light to convey the weight and dignity of labor. Theo was supportive, but even he sometimes gently suggested that Vincent might consider lighter subjects, brighter colors, things that might be more commercially appealing. Vincent understood the practical concern. He knew that dark paintings of peasants were not easy to sell. He knew that if he wanted to make a living from his art, he would need to think about what the market wanted. But he could not bring himself to paint things he did not believe in. He could not make cheerful, decorative pictures just because they might sell. It felt dishonest to him. If his paintings did not reflect his actual convictions, then what was the point of making them? So he continued with the subjects that mattered to him. He refined his approach. He worked on his technique. He tried to make his figures more convincing, his compositions more balanced. He experimented with how much shadow to use, how to suggest depth without losing clarity. He was learning, slowly, how to handle paint, how to build up layers, how to mix colors to get the exact tone he wanted. It was painstaking work. A single painting might take days or weeks. He would work on it, then step back and see what was wrong. Often, many things were wrong. The proportions were off. The light did not fall correctly. The color was muddy or too flat. He would try to fix these problems, but sometimes the fixes created new problems. Paint could be scraped away and repainted, but each layer affected what came after. Oil painting required patience and planning in a way that drawing did not. He painted people eating, sitting together at a simple meal. He was interested in these moments of communal life, the way families gathered, the rituals of breaking bread together. He wanted to capture the quiet intimacy of these scenes, the way lamplight softened faces, the way hands reached for food or held a cup. These were not grand or dramatic moments, but they were human moments, real moments. His palette remained dark. Browns dominated. Grays. Deep reds and greens that were almost brown. He was not afraid of darkness. He did not see it as something to be avoided or corrected. It was part of the world he was painting, part of the mood he wanted to create. The life of peasants was hard. Their homes were dim. Their clothing was worn. To paint them in bright, cheerful colors would be to lie about their reality. But within that darkness, he tried to find warmth. The glow of a fire. The soft light of an oil lamp. The faint illumination from a window. These small sources of light became important in his paintings. They suggested endurance. The way people made homes and found comfort even in difficult circumstances. The way a simple meal or a warm room could be a kind of grace. He was teaching himself as he went. There were no instructors standing over his shoulder, correcting his mistakes. He learned by doing, by trying something and seeing if it worked, by comparing his paintings to the works he admired and trying to understand where his own fell short. It was a slow, sometimes frustrating process. But it was also deeply absorbing. Some days the work went well. A passage of paint would come together in a way that pleased him. The light on a face would feel real. A hand would have weight and presence. These small successes kept him going. They were evidence that he was improving, even if the improvement was gradual and hard-won. Other days, nothing seemed to work. The paint would not do what he wanted. The composition would feel wrong. Hours of effort would result in something that looked lifeless or awkward. On those days, he felt the full weight of his limitations. The gap between his intentions and his abilities seemed unbridgeable. He would go to bed discouraged, wondering if he was wasting his time, wasting Theo's money, chasing something he would never be able to achieve. But the next morning, he would get up and try again. That was the discipline he had developed. The commitment to showing up, regardless of how the previous day had gone. To treating the work as a practice, something that required steady effort over time rather than sudden breakthroughs. He continued to observe. That was perhaps the most important part of his process. Looking closely at the world around him. Noticing how light changed throughout the day. How shadows deepened in the evening. How a person's posture shifted when they were tired. How fabric draped over a shoulder or gathered at a waist. All of these details mattered. They were what made a painting feel true. Vincent was building something. Not quickly. Not in a way that brought immediate recognition or reward. But he was learning his craft. He was developing his eye. He was figuring out how to translate what he saw and felt into paint on canvas. The early works were dark and heavy, yes. They were not what people expected or wanted. But they were honest. They came from a real place. From a genuine desire to honor the lives of working people. To give them presence and weight in art. And so he kept painting. His small dark canvases accumulated. Studies of peasants. Interiors. Rural scenes. Each one a step forward in his understanding. Each one a quiet insistence that these subjects were worth his time and attention. That the lives of ordinary people, lived in ordinary rooms, under ordinary light, contained something essential and true. The world did not embrace these early paintings. But Vincent continued anyway, trusting that the work itself mattered, whether or not anyone else could see it yet. As this chapter of Vincent's life comes to a close, nothing has yet settled into place. He has moved through cities and occupations, through hope and disappointment, through moments of closeness and long stretches of loneliness. He has tried to belong, to work, to love, to the world around him, and each attempt has left him feeling more uncertain than before. These years have not brought answers. They have brought questions. And yet, beneath the restlessness, something steady has been forming. A deep concern for others. A sensitivity to suffering. A desire to give his life meaning through service, even if he does not yet know how. Vincent does not turn toward art here. Not yet. Instead, his searching begins to lean inward, toward faith, toward belief, toward the hope that devotion and sacrifice might offer the clarity he has not been able to find elsewhere. In the next chapter, we follow him into that devotion. Into a life shaped by spiritual intensity and compassion without limits. into a place where his empathy for others deepens, even as his own certainty begins to fracture. For now, we leave Vincent still searching, still unresolved. A life unfolding slowly without answers. And if you choose to continue listening, episode 3 will meet him there at the edge of faith, devotion, and quiet transformation.